The early morning mist hung low over the National Mall in Washington, D.C., as Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen made his way along the familiar path. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. At 5:30 a.m., the usual crowds of tourists were still hours away from arriving, leaving the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in peaceful silence. Marcus walked with purpose, his military boots making soft sounds against the pavement. Even though he wasn't in uniform today, wearing just a simple black t-shirt and jeans, his military bearing was obvious in the way he carried himself. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left their mark, not just in the small scar above his right eyebrow, but in the alert way his dark eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. As he approached the black granite wall, Marcus pulled out a small notebook from his back pocket. It was worn and weather-beaten, much like the man who carried it. Inside were the carefully written details about Panel 24E, Line 58, the exact location where James "Jimmy" Rodriguez's name was etched into history. Jimmy wasn't just another name on the wall. He had been Marcus's father's best friend during the Vietnam War, and the stories of their friendship had shaped Marcus's childhood. Every Friday morning for the past year, Marcus had come to visit Jimmy's name, keeping a promise he'd made to his father before the old man passed away 6 months ago. The morning air was cool against his skin as Marcus reached out to touch the smooth surface of the wall. His fingers traced the letters of Jimmy's name, just as his father had done countless times before. In the polished black granite, Marcus could see his own reflection, a 34-year-old soldier who now understood war in ways his teenage self never could have imagined. "Good morning, Uncle Jimmy," Marcus whispered, using the name he'd called him as a child, even though they weren't really related. He pulled out a small folding chair from his backpack and sat down, opening his notebook. This was part of his weekly ritual, sitting with Jimmy and writing down his thoughts about the past week. Today's entry was about a young soldier in Marcus's unit who reminded him of the stories his father used to tell about Jimmy, always ready with a joke, but serious when it counted. Marcus wrote about how he was helping this soldier adjust to civilian life after their last deployment, just as Jimmy had helped his father decades ago. As he wrote, the first rays of sunlight began to hit the wall, making the black granite shine. The names seemed to glow, all 58,318 of them, each one representing a life given in service to their country. Marcus paused his writing to watch this daily transformation. No matter how many times he saw it, the sight never failed to move him. A few early morning joggers passed by, respectfully slowing their pace as they neared the memorial. One older man, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, gave Marcus a knowing nod. They shared an unspoken understanding. Some places were sacred, and this was one of them. Marcus checked his watch, 6:15 a.m. He had been here for 45 minutes already, but time always seemed to flow differently at the wall. He wrote a few more lines in his notebook, describing how the morning light made the wall look like a mirror into another world. His father used to say something similar. Standing up, Marcus carefully folded his chair and returned it to his backpack. He pulled out a small American flag and placed it at the base of the wall, adjusting it until it stood perfectly straight. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. Before stepping back, he reached out one last time to touch Jimmy's name. "Take care of Dad up there, Uncle Jimmy," he said softly. "I'll be back next week." The morning was growing brighter now, and soon the first tour buses would arrive. Marcus shouldered his backpack, did one final check to make sure everything was in order, and began walking back along the path. The day was just beginning, but he had already completed his most important task, keeping the memory of those who served alive, one quiet morning visit at a time. The peaceful morning at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial shattered like glass when the first rumble of motorcycle engines echoed across the National Mall. Marcus Chen's head snapped up at the sound, his military training automatically kicking in as he assessed the approaching noise. It wasn't just one bike, he could distinguish at least 5 different engines, their thunderous roars growing louder by the second. Around the corner they came, riding in a loose V formation. 5 motorcycles, all of them large cruiser bikes with gleaming chrome pipes and custom paint jobs. The riders wore matching leather vests with Road Warriors MC patches done across their backs. Empty beer cans rattled in their saddlebags, a clear sign that their night of partying hadn't quite ended with the sunrise. The lead rider, a massive man with a gray-streaked beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, pulled his bike right up to the memorial's entrance. He shut off his engine but left his music playing, heavy metal blasting from custom speakers. The other 4 riders followed his lead, creating a wall of parked bikes that blocked the memorial's main path. "Hey, boys," the leader shouted, his voice rough from too many cigarettes. "Check out this fancy wall." He stumbled slightly as he got off his bike, pulling a half-empty beer can from his cup holder. The other bikers laughed, their voices too loud for the sacred space. Marcus watched as a small group of early morning visitors quickly gathered their things and moved away. An elderly couple who had been placing flowers by a name hurried off, the woman clutching her husband's arm. A young mother steered her curious children in the opposite direction. The second biker, shorter but stocky with a shaved head, cracked open a fresh beer. "Man, I needed to take a leak anyway," he announced, starting to walk behind the memorial wall. His boots scraped against the pavement as he swaggered. "Hold up, Tommy," called out a third biker, this one wearing mirrored sunglasses despite the early hour. "Let's get a picture first." "Hey, Rick," he waved to the leader. "Get your bike closer to the wall. It'll make a sweet photo for the club's Instagram." Rick, the leader, grinned and started pushing his motorcycle across the grass toward the memorial. The massive bike's wheels left deep tracks in the dew-dampened ground. The morning sun caught on his bike's custom skull ornaments, creating dancing reflections on the memorial's black granite surface. 2 more bikers, younger than the others and clearly trying to impress their leader, began tossing their empty cans onto the memorial grounds. One of them pulled out a spray paint can from his saddlebag, nudging his friend with a mischievous grin. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he watched them, his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, slowly curled into fists. The notebook in his back pocket, filled with his morning thoughts about his father and Uncle Jimmy, seemed to grow heavier. 20 feet away, the small American flag he had placed at the base of the wall fluttered in the breeze, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around it. A few other early morning visitors had stopped at a safe distance, some already on their phones, likely calling the park police. But Marcus knew it would take at least 5 minutes for any officers to arrive. He watched as Rick leaned his heavy motorcycle against the memorial wall, the metal kickstand scraping against the precious granite surface. The wall where, just moments ago, Marcus had traced Jimmy Rodriguez's name with reverent fingers. The wall that held the names of 58,318 Americans who had given their lives. The wall that his father had visited every month until he was too sick to make the trip. Marcus took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him when to act and when to wait. As Rick pulled out a cigarette and dropped the match on the ground, Marcus knew this was a time for action. He stepped forward, his movement deliberate and controlled, like a coiled spring ready to release. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the memorial grounds as he approached the group. Behind him, the names on the wall seemed to watch in silence, waiting to see how their sanctuary would be defended. Marcus Chen covered the distance to the bikers in measured steps, his combat boots silent against the pathway. The morning air had grown thick with tension, and even the birds seemed to have stopped their singing. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, though every muscle in his body was ready to react. "Sir," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used to command troops in Afghanistan. "This is hallowed ground. You need to move your motorcycle away from the wall." Rick, the biker leader, turned slowly. The cigarette dangled from his lips as he looked Marcus up and down, clearly trying to decide if this interruption was worth his attention. Behind him, his motorcycle's kickstand continued to leave a small mark on the granite wall. Well, Rick drawled, blowing smoke in Marcus's direction. "Looks like we got ourselves a Boy Scout." The other bikers snickered, forming a loose semicircle around their leader. Tommy, the stocky one who'd wanted to relieve himself, cracked his knuckles with exaggerated slowness. Marcus didn't flinch at the smoke or the approaching bikers. His eyes remained locked on Rick's, even as he maintained awareness of where each biker stood. 3 tours in active combat zones had taught him how to track multiple threats without appearing to look at them. "I'm asking respectfully," Marcus continued, gesturing to the wall. "There are 58,318 names on this memorial. Each one represents someone's father, brother, son, or friend who gave their life for this country. They deserve better than this." Rick took a long drag from his cigarette before dropping it and grinding it out with his boot, right on the memorial grounds. "You counting all the names yourself, tough guy?" He stepped closer to Marcus, using his height advantage to try to intimidate. Or are you just another 1-8 who likes to hang around war memorials pretending he's a hero? The other bikers spread out further, their boots scuffing on the pavement. The one with the spray paint can had slipped it back into his pocket, but his hand remained there ready. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the memorial grounds, like dark fingers reaching for the wall. I've counted one name every week for the past year, Marcus replied quietly. James Rodriguez, panel 24E, line 58. He was my father's best friend in Vietnam. Saved my father's life twice before giving his own. He paused, letting his words sink in. Each name on this wall has a story just like that. Stories of sacrifice, courage, and loss. For a moment, something flickered across Rick's face, perhaps recognition, perhaps doubt, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a sneer. Save the history lesson, boy. This is our spot now. He turned back to his motorcycle, deliberately pressing it harder against the wall. That's when Marcus noticed the veteran's pin partially hidden under the dirt and grime on Rick's vest. It was old, probably Vietnam era. The realization hit him. Rick wasn't just any troublemaker. He was a veteran himself, acting out for reasons Marcus could only guess at. You know better than this, Marcus said, his voice lower now, meant for Rick's ears alone. That pin on your vest, you served. These are your brothers on this wall. Rick spun around, his face flushing red. The other bikers tensed, sensing the shift in their leader's mood. You don't know nothing about me or my brothers, he snarled, grabbing for Marcus's collar with his meaty hand. The rest happened in slow motion. Rick's fingers brushed the fabric of Marcus's shirt just as the sound of a motorcycle backfiring echoed from somewhere on the mall. To the average person, it was just noise. But to two combat veterans, it triggered something deeper. Marcus saw the minute widening of Rick's eyes, the involuntary tension in his shoulders, the same reaction Marcus himself had suppressed through years of therapy and training. For a split second, they weren't a troublemaker and a protector. They were just two soldiers, brought back to moments they tried to forget. But while Marcus had learned to channel his reactions, Rick's trauma exploded outward. His grab for Marcus's collar became a wild punch, his face contorted with a rage born of memories he couldn't control. The other bikers surged forward, misreading the situation, thinking this was the fight their leader wanted. They couldn't have been more wrong. Time seemed to slow down as Rick's fist came toward Marcus's face. The other visitors to the memorial had backed away to a safe distance, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the ground, making the scene look like something out of an old Western movie. Marcus didn't move, not yet. His military training had taught him patience. He watched as Rick's balance shifted forward, noticed how the biker's rage made his punch wide and sloppy. Behind Rick, the other four bikers had spread out in a circle, thinking they had Marcus trapped. They didn't realize they were exactly where he wanted them. Last chance, Marcus said calmly, even as Rick's fist was just inches from his face. Walk away, and we can forget this happened. Rick's response was to throw another punch with his other hand. This time, Marcus moved. He shifted his weight slightly to the left, letting Rick's first punch brush past his ear. The movement was so small that most of the watching crowd probably missed it, but that tiny dodge sent Rick stumbling forward, his own momentum working against him. Tommy, the stocky biker, rushed forward to help his leader. Get him, he shouted, pulling something from his back pocket that glinted in the sunlight. Brass knuckles. The other three bikers moved in as well, their boots scraping against the pavement. Marcus remained perfectly still, only his eyes moving as he tracked each threat. His breathing was steady, controlled. He'd faced worse odds in Afghanistan. Much worse. These 5 angry men weren't trained fighters. They were bullies who relied on numbers and intimidation. You're on sacred ground, Marcus reminded them, his voice carrying across the morning air. There are men on this wall who died protecting our right to stand here today. Think about what you're doing. The biker with the spray paint can hesitated, looking uncertain. But Tommy and the others kept coming. Rick had regained his balance and was red-faced with embarrassment and rage. He reached for his belt, where a heavy chain was wrapped around his waist. That's when they all heard it. Police sirens in the distance, getting closer. Someone in the crowd must have called them. The youngest biker, the one with the spray paint, started backing away. Rick, maybe we should. Shut up, Rick roared, unwrapping the chain from his belt. "Nobody makes a fool of me. Nobody." Marcus watched as Rick swung the chain in a wide arc. The metal links whistled through the air and struck the granite wall of the memorial with a sharp clang. The sound echoed across the grounds like a gunshot. Everything stopped. Every biker, even Rick, froze at the sound of metal striking the sacred wall. A small mark was visible where the chain had hit, right below a column of names. The crowd gasped. Several veterans who had been watching from a distance started moving forward, their faces hard with anger. Marcus didn't look at the mark on the wall. He couldn't. If he did, he knew his careful control would slip. Instead, he focused on Rick's face, seeing something he recognized. The moment when bravado crumbles and reality sets in. The biker leader's eyes had gone wide, staring at what he'd done to the memorial. "I didn't," Rick started to say, the chain falling from his suddenly loose grip. It clattered to the ground, the sound seeming to echo off the black granite walls. But it was too late for apologies. The sirens were getting closer, and now there was visible damage to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The other bikers started backing away from Rick, realizing how serious things had become. Tommy dropped his brass knuckles, trying to kick them under a nearby bench. Marcus took a deep breath, centering himself. The next few moments would determine how this ended. The crowd was watching. The police were coming. And somewhere Marcus knew, his father and Uncle Jimmy were watching too. He had to handle this right, not just for himself, but for every name on that wall. The damage to the memorial wall changed everything. Marcus could feel the shift in the air, like the heavy stillness before a storm. The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and now included several veterans who had been visiting other monuments nearby. They stood with straight backs and hard eyes, watching the scene unfold. Rick stared at the mark his chain had left on the wall, his face pale beneath his scraggly beard. For a moment, he looked like a different person, not the tough biker leader, but a lost man who had just crossed a line he never meant to cross. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the veteran's pin on his vest. "I didn't mean to." Rick's voice trailed off as he touched the scratched granite. Behind him, his fellow bikers shifted nervously, looking between their leader and the approaching sound of police sirens. The young one with the spray paint had already backed away to the motorcycles. Marcus spoke quietly, but his voice carried across the morning air. "You have exactly 1 minute to make this right." He pulled out his phone and held it up, showing the time. "That's how long before the park police arrive. 1 minute to decide how this ends." Tommy, still trying to act tough despite his obvious nervousness, stepped forward. "You threatening us, soldier boy?" But his voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying his fear. "Not a threat," Marcus replied calmly. "A chance. Same kind of chance my father's friend Jimmy gave him in '68, the kind of chance that saves lives." He nodded toward the wall. "The kind of chance some of these men never got." Rick's head snapped up at that. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or remembrance. His hand went to the veteran's pin again, this time gripping it tightly. "What's it gonna be?" Marcus asked, still keeping his voice level. "We can wait for the police, add vandalism of a national monument to whatever else happened last night." He paused, letting that sink in. "Or you can show these people watching that you remember what that pin means." The sirens were getting closer. A Park Service truck had appeared at the far end of the mall, its lights flashing. The crowd had their phones out, recording everything. The younger bikers were already edging toward their motorcycles, ready to run. Rick turned to face Marcus fully. His face had transformed. The drunken bravado was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Shame? Regret? Or maybe just the sudden, stark realization of what he'd almost done to a place that should have been sacred to him, too. "I served," Rick said roughly, his voice catching. "2 tours. 71 and 72. He stopped, swallowed hard. "Lost my brother here. Panel 35W. Marcus nodded slowly. "Then you know what needs to happen next." For a long moment, nobody moved. The morning sun had risen higher, making the black granite shine. The names seemed to stand out more clearly now, each one a silent witness to what was unfolding before them. Rick's shoulders slumped, but somehow he looked taller for it. He turned to his crew, his voice carrying the kind of authority that must have served him well in Vietnam. "Tommy, get the first aid kit from your bike. Cut some polish in there that might help with this mark. Mike, Grab those cleaning rags from your saddlebag. He faced Marcus again, this time with a different kind of determination in his eyes. We made this mess. We'll clean it up. He hesitated, then added quietly, if you'll let us. The police sirens were very close now, maybe 2 blocks away. Marcus could see the flashing lights reflecting off nearby buildings. He had a choice to make, and about 10 seconds to make it. He thought about his father, about Uncle Jimmy, about all the names on the wall behind him, about second chances and what they really meant, about how healing sometimes started in the strangest ways. Marcus took a deep breath and made his decision. Marcus looked at his phone one last time. 30 seconds until the police would arrive. He made his choice and stepped forward, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Start cleaning, he said to Rick. I'll talk to the officers. But Tommy, still running hot on alcohol and wounded pride, had other plans. While Rick was reaching for the cleaning supplies, Tommy suddenly lunged forward with his brass knuckles. Forget this, he shouted. No cop's gonna. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the watching crowd. Marcus moved like flowing water, his years of combat training taking over. As Tommy charged, Marcus simply wasn't where the punch landed. Instead, he had shifted slightly to the left, his right hand already moving. In one fluid motion, Marcus caught Tommy's extended arm, used the bigger man's momentum against him, and redirected him toward the ground. Tommy's feet left the pavement for a split second before he landed hard on his stomach, his brass knuckles skittering away across the concrete. Before anyone could blink, Marcus had Tommy's arm locked behind his back in a perfect compliance hold. He applied just enough pressure to control, not hurt. The move was so smooth, so professional, that several of the watching veterans nodded in approval. Stay down, Marcus said quietly to Tommy. Don't make this worse than it needs to be. The other bikers stood frozen, watching their friend pinned to the ground by a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. Rick stepped forward, but not to fight. Instead, he barked out, "Stand down. All of you, stand down now." The authority in Rick's voice, the voice of a former sergeant, Marcus guessed, made the other bikers step back. Rick knelt down next to Tommy, speaking in a low, hard voice. You're done. You hear me? Done. One more move, and I'll let him hand you over to the cops myself. 2 parked police cars pulled up to the memorial entrance, lights flashing. 4 officers stepped out, hands on their belts as they assessed the situation. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, many with phones still recording. Marcus maintained his hold on Tommy, but called out to the approaching officers, "Situation under control, sir. Would appreciate your assistance." His military bearing was evident in every word and movement. The lead officer, a veteran himself judging by his bearing, took in the scene quickly. He saw Marcus's controlled hold, noticed Rick's veteran's pin, and spotted the cleaning supplies scattered on the ground. Most importantly, he saw the small mark on the memorial wall. What happened here? The officer asked, though his tone suggested he had a good idea. Marcus spoke first, his voice clear and professional. There was a misunderstanding, sir. These gentlemen were about to help clean up some accidental damage to the wall when this individual, he nodded toward Tommy, made an unfortunate choice. Rick stepped forward, standing at what was almost attention. Officer, I'm responsible for the damage. We're prepared to make it right and accept whatever consequences come with it. The lead officer looked between Marcus and Rick, then at the watching crowd. Several veterans in the crowd nodded slightly. They had seen everything and understood what Marcus was trying to do. Release him, the officer said to Marcus, who immediately helped Tommy to his feet. Tommy stood there rubbing his arm, all his fight gone, looking embarrassed. The officer turned to Rick. The memorial staff will need to inspect the damage. You'll have to file a report, and there will be consequences. He paused, looking at Rick's veteran's pin. And how those consequences play out might depend on what happens in the next hour. Rick nodded, understanding perfectly. He turned to his crew, his voice firm. Get the cleaning supplies. All of them. We're not leaving until this place shines. Marcus stepped back, watching as the bikers began gathering their cleaning materials. The morning sun had fully risen now, making the black granite gleam. Somewhere on that wall, he knew Uncle Jimmy would have approved of how things had turned out. Sometimes, the best victory wasn't in taking an enemy down. It was in helping them stand back up. The next hour at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was unlike anything the regular morning visitors had ever seen. Under the watchful eyes of the park police, Rick and his bikers worked to clean not just the mark their chain had left, but the entire section of wool around it. The morning sun climbed higher as they worked, their leather vests soon covered in sweat. Marcus stayed nearby, helping guide their efforts. He showed them how to properly care for the granite surface, knowledge he'd gained from his many mornings spent at the memorial. Gentle circles, he demonstrated with a cleaning cloth. Let the solution do the work. The crowd had thinned out, but those who remained were no longer filming with their phones. Instead, they watched in respectful silence as the bikers worked. A few veterans who had been visiting other monuments came over to help, sharing their own cleaning supplies and expertise. Tommy, his earlier aggression completely gone, worked harder than anyone. His face was red with shame as he polished the granite around panel 35, where Rick's brother's name was etched. The brass knuckles that had clattered across the pavement were now in a park police evidence bag. "I'm sorry," Tommy said quietly to Rick as they worked side by side. "I never knew about your brother." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Rick just nodded, focusing on his cleaning. But after a moment, he spoke. "Michael Richards, panel 35, line 43. Best point man in the unit. My little brother." He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "I haven't visited him in 15 years. Couldn't face it." The lead park police officer, who had introduced himself as Sergeant Williams, stood talking with Marcus near the memorial entrance. "You handled that well," Williams said, watching the bikers work. "Could have gone very differently." Marcus nodded. Sometimes people just need a chance to remember who they really are. He looked at Rick, who was now explaining something about the wool to his younger club members. Their faces were serious as they listened, all traces of their earlier drunken bravado gone. A memorial staff member had arrived to inspect the damage. She moved carefully along the wall, making notes on a clipboard. After several minutes, she approached Sergeant Williams and Marcus with her assessment. "The mark is superficial," she explained, relief evident in her voice. "The cleaning they're doing should take care of it. We'll need to file a report, of course, and there will be a mandatory donation to the memorial's maintenance fund." She looked at the bikers, still hard at work. "But I don't think we need to press charges." Sergeant Williams agreed. "I think they've learned their lesson. We'll confiscate the brass knuckles and issue citations for the open containers. But the main thing is protecting the memorial." He turned to Marcus. "You'll vouch for them following through on the donation?" "I will," Marcus said. He knew it was the right call. Sometimes justice needed to be tempered with understanding. As the morning wore on, more regular visitors began arriving at the memorial. They walked quietly past the working bikers, some stopping to read the names on the wall. A few older veterans among the visitors recognized what was happening. The looks on their faces said they'd seen this kind of redemption before. Rick stood up slowly, his back stiff from bending over. He looked at the now gleaming section of wall, then at his reflection in the black granite. For a moment, he stood very still, his hand reaching out to touch his brother's name. Marcus watched as the tough biker leader's shoulders began to shake slightly. Without drawing attention to it, he moved between Rick and the passing tourists, giving the man a moment of privacy with his brother. The other bikers pretended not to notice their leader's tears, keeping busy with their cleaning. But something had changed in how they carried themselves. The memorial was no longer just a wall to them. It had become something sacred, something personal. A park volunteer appeared with bottles of water for everyone. As she handed them out, she smiled at Marcus. "You come here every Friday, don't you?" she asked. "To visit your father's friend?" Marcus nodded, accepting a bottle. "Uncle Jimmy," he said softly. "He'd be proud of today." 1 week later, Marcus arrived at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial for his regular Friday morning visit. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. As he walked along the familiar path, he noticed something different. The section of wall that had been damaged was now cleaner than he ever seen it. He pulled out his small folding chair and notebook, settling into his usual spot near panel 24E. As he traced Uncle Jimmy's name with his fingers, he heard the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. This time, though, it was different. The engines were quieter, more respectful of the sacred space. Around the corner came Rick, riding alone. His motorcycle was clean, the chrome polished to a mirror shine. He was wearing his leather vest, but it looked different. Someone had carefully cleaned and restored the old veteran's pin, making it shine like new. Rick parked his bike properly in the designated area, turned off the engine, and walked slowly toward the wall. He nodded to Marcus but didn't speak. Instead, he moved directly to panel 35 dull, where his brother's name was etched in the black granite. Marcus watched as the big biker leader pulled something from his vest pocket, a small piece of paper and a pencil. With shaking hands, Rick did what thousands of visitors had done before him. He made a rubbing of his brother's name. "First time I've done this," Rick said quietly, not turning around. "Should've done it years ago." Marcus stayed silent, giving the man his moment. After a while, Rick spoke again. "The club met last night. Voted on some changes." He carefully folded the paper with his brother's name and put it in his wallet. "We're starting a new tradition. Once a month, we'll come here. Help with cleaning, maintenance, whatever's needed." "That's good," Marcus replied simply. Rick turned finally, looking at the small American flag Marcus had just placed at the base of the wall. "Tommy's doing community service at the VFW. His choice. Said he wants to understand better." He paused. "The young ones, they never knew what this place really meant. My fault. Should've taught them." "You're teaching them now," Marcus said. The morning light was growing stronger, making the wall shine. More visitors were beginning to arrive, and Marcus could see some of them recognizing Rick from the videos that had circulated online. But instead of fear or anger, their faces showed something else: respect for a man who was trying to make things right. "Got something else to tell you," Rick said, shifting his weight. "Did some asking around about your Uncle Jimmy. Rodriguez, right? James Rodriguez." When Marcus nodded, Rick continued. "Found some guys from his unit. They meet up every couple months at a diner in Arlington. They'd like to meet you, share some stories about your dad's friend." Marcus felt his throat tighten. In all his years of visiting, he'd never managed to find any of Uncle Jimmy's old unit. That would mean a lot," he managed to say. Rick nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Least I could do. After everything." He looked back at the wall, at all the names shining in the morning light. "You know, I spent 15 years running from this place. Drinking, raising hell, trying to forget, but you can't forget. Shouldn't forget." More motorcycles could be heard approaching, the rest of Rick's club, right on time for their promised monthly cleaning. But these engines were muted, respectful. As they parked and walked up, each biker carried cleaning supplies and wore a small American flag pin on their vest. "Welcome home, brother," Marcus said quietly to Rick. The older veteran's eyes glistened as he watched his club members approach the memorial with respect. "Yeah," he said roughly. "Finally feel like I am." The morning sun climbed higher as the two men stood before the wall, united in their respect for the names etched in black granite. Behind them, Rick's motorcycle club began their work, speaking in hushed voices, handling their cleaning supplies with care. Marcus opened his notebook, ready to write about this morning's visit. He had a feeling his father and Uncle Jimmy would have liked this ending. How a moment of conflict had turned into something healing. How respect had been lost and found again. How the sacred ground of the memorial had worked its quiet magic once more. Some battles, he realized, were won not with fists or force, but with understanding and second chances.